How did the desert sun of 1943 nearly melt the alliance between Dwight D. Eisenhower and Bernard Montgomery as Erwin Rommel's panzers tore through the American lines? The disaster at Kasserine Pass forced Winston Churchill to intervene before George S. Patton could even draw his revolver. It was a moment of absolute crisis where inexperience met the veteran steel of the Wehrmacht, threatening to shatter the Allied dream of victory. By February 23, 1943, the dust of the Libyan desert had begun to settle behind the British Eighth Army, but for Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery, the true storm was only just beginning to brew in the high, jagged passes of Tunisia. Seated within the sterile, map-strewn confines of his headquarters in Tripoli, Montgomery reviewed a relentless stream of situation reports that painted a harrowing picture of Allied instability, watching as clerks and staff officers moved with frantic precision to update casualty figures that grew more grim by the hour. The Axis retreat from Libya had concluded with a deceptive sense of success, yet the campaign in Tunisia remained a jagged, unresolved wound where Allied forces were dangerously divided by conflicting nationalities, clashing military doctrines, and a catastrophic disparity in combat experience. Only days earlier, the American contingent had suffered a humiliating and severe defeat at the Kasserine Pass, and the ripples of this failure were currently tearing through the Allied command structure like a seismic shock. This battle, fought with desperate intensity between February 19th and 25th in the heart of central Tunisia, served as the first major baptism of fire between raw American ground forces and the seasoned, lethal German units operating under the Desert Fox himself, Field Marshal Erwin Rommel. The Americans entered the fray with an optimism that was quickly scorched away by the reality of modern mechanized warfare, as poor coordination and fragmented command authority left their divisions exposed to the lightning-fast maneuvers of German armored columns. Montgomery looked upon these reports with a cold, analytical eye, noting how entire American formations had simply broken under the relentless pressure of the panzer divisions, abandoning their sophisticated equipment and fleeing their positions in withdrawals that could only be described as disorganized and chaotic. While the defeat was not a total strategic collapse, its psychological impact was unmistakable, shaking the very foundations of confidence within the Allied high command and forcing a brutal reckoning with the reality of their situation. Although Montgomery had not personally commanded at Kasserine, the outcome of the disaster confirmed every cynical assumption he harbored regarding the readiness of his new partners across the Atlantic. He was a man who had spent years locked in a deadly dance with German forces across the North African expanse, emerging from the pivotal Second Battle of El Alamein with a global reputation built upon the pillars of methodical planning and an almost obsessive level of rigid control. To a commander of Montgomery's temperament, discipline, centralized command, and the application of overwhelming, concentrated force were not merely tactical preferences, but absolute necessities for survival against an enemy as professional as the Wehrmacht. The American performance at Kasserine appeared to him as damning evidence of a dangerous lack of preparation for the realities of modern war, a failure he believed stemmed from a culture that prioritized individual initiative over the machine-like synchronization required on the 20th century battlefield. In the shadows of his private communications with British superiors in London, Montgomery did not mince words, launching a blunt and scathing critique that described American units as fundamentally unready for the rigors of sustained combat. He openly questioned the judgment and professional competence of their senior commanders, viewing their leadership as amateurish when compared to the battle-hardened officers of the British Empire. These assessments were never intended for American eyes, nor were they issued as public statements that might jeopardize the fragile political coalition between Roosevelt and Churchill. Instead, they were written with the sharp, clinical tone of an internal military critique, shaped by a deep-seated frustration and a fervent belief that absolute candor among allies was the only way to ensure their collective survival in a war that offered no room for error. Yet the language he employed was so harsh and his conclusions so sweeping that they threatened to create a permanent rift in the alliance even as the defeat at Kasserine forced immediate and radical changes on the ground. General Dwight D. Eisenhower, the Supreme Allied Commander in North Africa, found himself in the middle of this burgeoning storm and responded with a decisive restructuring of the American command hierarchy. With a heavy heart but a firm hand, Eisenhower began the painful process of removing officers he believed had failed to hold their ground under the crushing pressure of Rommel's advance. consolidating authority instead under leaders who possessed stronger, more aggressive battlefield instincts. These changes were implemented with lightning speed, yet they simultaneously underscored the terrifying extent to which the Americans had been unprepared for the massive scale and frantic tempo of the fighting they were now forced to endure. Eisenhower, a man of profound strategic vision, understood with painful clarity that the problem was significantly larger than any single tactical blunder on a Tunisian hillside. The American army had undergone an expansion at an unprecedented and perhaps reckless speed, drawing in millions of civilians, training them with frantic haste, and shipping them overseas with only a shadow of the combat experience possessed by their German adversaries. While American military doctrine emphasized the virtues of flexibility and individual initiative, those perceived strengths had not yet been tempered in the forge of sustained enemy pressure. Kasserine had exposed deep structural weaknesses that simply could not be corrected overnight. And for a man like Montgomery, the issue was not merely tactical, but deeply cultural. Montgomery viewed the British Army as a force hardened by years of agonizing war, a military machine shaped by the bitter lessons of failure and adaptation since the dark days of 1939. In his view, the American forces were dangerously new to the complexities of large-scale land combat against a first-rate industrial power like Germany. And in the privacy of his journals, he expressed grave doubts about whether they could learn fast enough to meet the escalating demands of the Mediterranean campaign. The skepticism was not unique to Montgomery. It reflected a much wider and more pervasive sentiment within the upper echelons of the British command, where years of experience were equated with the only true form of authority, and survival was seen as the ultimate source of moral credibility. These judgmental views began to circulate quietly but persistently through British communication channels, where senior officers read them, debated them, and in many instances found themselves in total agreement with Montgomery's dismissive tone. However, even the most critical British officers recognized the immense political danger inherent in such judgments, knowing full well that the entire war effort now depended upon American manpower and industrial production at a scale that Great Britain could never hope to match. Any fracture in the trust between the two nations risked undermining the entire global alliance, potentially handing the Axis powers the window they needed to stabilize their crumbling fronts. While the generals bickered and analyzed in their comfortable headquarters, the American soldiers on the ground were absorbing the consequences of defeat in much more immediate and visceral ways. They were busy burying their dead in the rocky Tunisian soil, reorganizing their shattered and depleted units, and confronting the terrifying reality that the enemy they faced was disciplined, aggressive, and utterly unforgiving. For the thousands of young men who survived the retreat, Kasserine was not an abstract lesson in military theory, but a deeply personal and traumatic reckoning with fear, confusion, and the sudden loss of their comrades. The sense of failure among the American GIs was palpable and real, but beneath the surface of their shock, a new and powerful determination to recover and prove their worth was beginning to take root. On the other side of the line, even the legendary Rommel could not fully exploit his tactical victory at the pass as he had originally hoped. The Axis forces were stretched dangerously thin across the North African landscape, plagued by chronic shortages of fuel and vital supplies, and increasingly constricted by the growing dominance of Allied air power. The German advance eventually stalled as the logistical weight of the war caught up with them, and the window for a truly decisive breakthrough that could have driven the Allies back to the sea began to close. Strategically, the Battle of Kasserine Pass did not fundamentally alter the ultimate balance of power in North Africa, but psychologically, it left a deep, scarring mark on both sides of the Allied partnership. Unfazed by the shifting emotions of his allies, Montgomery continued his meticulous preparations, focused entirely on building a unified and disciplined fighting force that he believed should ideally operate under British command. He remained steadfast in his conviction that clarity of purpose and rigid control were the only tools that would win battles and save the lives of his men. But his private words, shaped by that singular moment of Allied weakness, were already beginning to move far beyond their intended audience in the British High Command. These words carried with them heavy assumptions that, if left unchallenged by the political leadership, threatened to harden into permanent divisions that could paralyze the Allied war machine. As February drew to a close, the physical battlefield in Tunisia began to stabilize. But the Allied partnership remained in a state of unsettled tension. The fighting had revealed much more than just tactical failures or the greenness of American troops. It had exposed competing and perhaps irreconcilable visions of how modern war should be fought, and more importantly, who was truly fit to lead the fight. The critical question facing the alliance was whether these deep-seated differences would be confronted openly, managed with quiet diplomacy, or allowed to fester and deepen beneath the surface of their cooperative efforts. Montgomery's biting assessments did not remain confined to a single desk or a fleeting moment in time. In the frantic days following the retreat from Kasserine, his private messages surged through British command channels, carried by signal officers, and read in headquarters spanning from the front lines in Tripoli all the way to the halls of power in London. They were discussed in high-level briefings and referenced in secret correspondence as senior British leaders attempted to grasp what had gone so wrong and how quickly the Americans could be brought up to speed. These words were remarkably frank, entirely unsoftened by the typical language of international diplomacy, and rooted in a professional belief that brutal honesty was the only currency that mattered in wartime. In these increasingly influential communications, Montgomery continued to describe American formations as utterly lacking in battlefield discipline, while simultaneously criticizing their command arrangements as fragmented, indecisive, and prone to panic. He openly doubted whether American senior officers possessed the necessary years of experience to control large, complex formations under the extreme pressure of a German counterattack. While such harsh judgments were not necessarily unusual within a military culture, where post-action assessments are often brutally blunt, what made these particular critiques dangerous was the broader, high-stakes context in which they were being disseminated. By early 1943, Great Britain had been locked in a life-or-death struggle for more than 3 long years. Its army had endured the stinging pain of defeats in France, the mountains of Greece, and the shifting sands of North Africa before finally achieving a measure of recovery and limited success. These harrowing experiences had profoundly shaped the British commanders, instilling in them a sense of extreme caution, a reliance on procedural rigor, and a deep intuitive awareness of German operational methods. Montgomery himself had built his entire towering reputation on the foundation of preparation and control, famously rejecting the idea of improvisation unless it was backed by the weight of overwhelming force. From his lofty perspective, the American methods of war appeared dangerously informal, overly optimistic, and insufficiently grounded in the hard-earned, bloody lessons of the last 3 years. Within the echo chambers of the British High Command, Montgomery's words were no longer mere observations. They had become a quiet infection, a narrative of American incompetence that threatened to rot the alliance from the inside out. These assessments did not remain confined to a single desk or a single moment of frustration. Instead, in the days following the disaster at Kasserine, his private messages surged through British command channels, carried by signal officers, and read in headquarters from the sun-scorched streets of Tripoli to the fog-drenched halls of London. They were discussed in briefings and referenced in correspondence as senior leaders attempted to dissect what had gone wrong and how quickly the American machine could be salvaged. The words were frank, unsoftened by the typical cushions of diplomatic language, and rooted in a professional belief that absolute honesty among allies was the only way to prevent a total catastrophe. Montgomery described American formations as fundamentally lacking battlefield discipline, and he characterized their command arrangements as fragmented, indecisive, and dangerously amateurish. He openly questioned whether American senior officers possessed the experience needed to control massive formations under the crushing weight of German operational methods. These judgments resonated because they played into existing doubts within the British leadership. Having endured 3 long years of war, including the bitter defeats in France, Greece, and early North Africa, the British had developed a culture of procedural rigor and a deep awareness of what it took to survive the Wehrmacht. Montgomery had built his reputation on the rejection of improvisation, preferring the safety of overwhelming force and methodical preparation. From his perspective, American methods appeared informal, optimistic, and dangerously disconnected from the bloody reality of the front. Many British officers shared these doubts, watching as American units arrived with pristine equipment but zero combat experience, emphasizing flexibility in ways that struck veterans as reckless. Montgomery's words gave form to these concerns, lending them the authority of a commander who had recently tasted victory. Yet senior figures also recognized the profound political danger. If this dismissal of American capability spread unchecked, it could corrode the foundation of the entire war effort. Across the Atlantic and in the upper echelons of the Allied command, American leaders were largely unaware of the specific phrasing of Montgomery's messages, but they could feel the cold undercurrent of judgment. Reports from British liaison officers carried a subtle edge of skepticism, and informal conversations in shared mess halls often revealed a growing impatience with American progress. For American commanders already grappling with the psychological weight of Kasserine, this perception of condescension added an agonizing layer of pressure. They weren't just fighting the Germans. They were fighting an internal battle for their own credibility. Dwight D. Eisenhower occupied a precarious position, serving as the ultimate bridge between these two worlds. He understood that the criticism was partially justified, but he also knew that morale was a strategic asset as vital as fuel or ammunition. Eisenhower worked quietly behind the scenes to address these deficiencies, while shielding his subordinates from the humiliation of British dismissal. The turning point came when these whispers reached the ears of Winston Churchill. By early March 1943, the Prime Minister was following every development in Tunisia with a hawk-like intensity, knowing that the security of the Mediterranean and the future of European operations hung in the balance. Churchill read Montgomery's language carefully, and he saw not just a military critique, but a political hand grenade. Having lived through the catastrophic mistrust between allies during the First World War, Churchill knew that if the Americans felt insulted or marginalized, the entire alliance could fracture. He recognized that Britain's very survival was now tethered to American industrial power and manpower, a scale Britain could never hope to match alone. To Churchill, criticism that undermined American confidence was a threat to the global strategy. Churchill did not dispute that the performance at Kasserine had been poor. He had read the same reports and seen the same failures. But he understood the trajectory of war. He knew that the American army was on a steep, inevitable learning curve, and that Britain itself had faced painful defeats before finding its footing. In a direct and forceful communication to Montgomery, Churchill reminded the Field Marshal that the war could not be won by Britain alone. He emphasized that American soldiers were not a peripheral contribution, but the central pillar of all future operations. Churchill made it clear that dismissive judgments were unacceptable, regardless of how much experience or frustration motivated them. This was not just a political leader speaking. It was a strategist reminding his general that alliances are fragile structures held together by respect and shared purpose. Montgomery received this rebuke with his characteristic reserve, and though he did not publicly defend his words or issue a retraction, the message was heard loud and clear. He remained focused on his command, but the outward pressure on the American leadership began to shift. Eisenhower felt the weight lift as it became clear that the political leadership in London would not allow professional criticism to harden into official policy. But the true response to Montgomery's skepticism was not coming from London. It was coming from the dust and mud of the Tunisian front lines. The American army did not wait for rhetoric to repair its reputation. It responded with a radical and immediate transformation at every level of command. In March 1943, General George S. Patton assumed command of the II Corps, and the atmosphere changed instantly. Patton brought a rigid, almost fanatical emphasis on order, accountability, and preparation, a sharp departure from the looser practices that had led to the Kasserine disaster. He demanded absolute adherence to regulations and clear chains of command, sending a signal to both his men and his allies that the United States Army was capable of enforcing standards as exacting as any in the world. Under Patton's shadow, American units began to stabilize. Defensive positions were constructed with a new attention to terrain and fields of fire, and the coordination between armor, infantry, and artillery was drilled until it functioned as an integrated system. The results were visible almost immediately in subsequent engagements. American troops held their ground against German probing attacks, and when they were forced to withdraw, they did so with an organized precision that replaced the earlier chaos. While losses continued, the confidence of the individual GI grew as they saw that proper preparation produced tangible results. British observers began to take note, and their reports shifted from skepticism to a gradual recognition that the Americans were learning at a rate the Germans had not expected. The assumption that inexperience equaled incapacity began to erode in the face of sustained battlefield performance. Montgomery himself, ever the pragmatist, began to encounter American formations that performed competently in joint actions, and he realized that the reality on the ground was moving faster than his previous assessments. Eisenhower's role in this transformation was central but understated, focusing on creating the conditions where competence could thrive rather than defending American pride with empty rhetoric. By removing ineffective commanders and supporting those with strong battlefield instincts, he reinforced trust within his own ranks and regained credibility among his allies. As the spring of 1943 progressed, the Axis forces in Tunisia found themselves squeezed between the tightening grip of the Allied air superiority and worsening logistical constraints. The battlefield became less forgiving of tactical errors, and the improved American coordination became a decisive factor in the final advance. By May 1943, the campaign in North Africa ended in a total Allied victory with the surrender of all Axis forces in Tunisia. It was a collective success, achieved through the sustained cooperation of British and American armies that had finally learned to function as a single machine. American units played a massive role in those final operations, contributing firepower and manpower at a scale that left no doubt about their capacity or their resilience. For Montgomery and the British command, the victory served as a practical lesson. Allies cannot be judged solely by their worst moments. They had seen that an army with resources and determination could adapt rapidly under pressure, and the early judgments of February 1943 no longer aligned with the reality of the soldiers they now commanded. This experience established the foundation for everything that followed. As planning began for the invasions of Italy and later Western Europe, the mutual dependence of the two nations was no longer a theoretical concept. It was a hard-won reality, tested in fire. By late 1943, the character of the partnership had evolved into something operationally inseparable, planning intelligence and resources at a level of integration never before seen in human history. When Montgomery was appointed to command the Allied ground forces for the invasion of Normandy, he did so with the knowledge that the majority of his landing troops would be the very Americans he had once doubted. In the lead-up to D-Day, the earlier narrative of American unreliability had vanished, replaced by the technical challenges of synchronization and timing. Montgomery's preference for deliberate planning now complemented the American strength in logistics and operational flexibility. Differences in style remain, but they were no longer seen as deficiencies to be mocked. They were treated as variables to be managed by professional leaders who understood that trust was the only thing standing between them and a catastrophic failure on the beaches. Winston Churchill watched this development with satisfaction, knowing his early intervention had preserved the space for this respect to grow. Eisenhower's leadership as Supreme Allied Commander in Europe further cemented this unity, as he balanced massive national interests with a consistent, unwavering emphasis on a single mission. When the ramps dropped on the morning of June 6, 1944, the American soldiers who stormed the Normandy coast faced conditions as brutal as anything encountered at Kasserine. Yet they did not break. They held their ground, reorganized under intense fire, and pushed inland with a competence that reflected years of hard-earned experience. Cooperation between British and American units became routine, and the respect between them was earned not through speeches, but through sustained performance in the hedgerows of France. Montgomery's role in these later campaigns was vital, but it was no longer defined by the isolated, harsh judgments of his private letters. His effectiveness now depended entirely on his collaboration with American commanders, whose capabilities were unquestioned and whose forces were essential for the final breakout into Germany. The alliance functioned because leaders had learned to subordinate their personal assessments and national pride to the collective necessity of the war. Looking back, the episode of Montgomery's criticism appears not as a scandal, but as a moment of extreme risk that was narrowly a intervention of political wisdom and battlefield adaptation. The war demanded that both individuals and institutions adjust or be left behind, and the Anglo-American partnership proved it could do exactly that. For the American soldiers, it was a quiet vindication. They had been tested, criticized, and measured against an unforgiving standard, and they had responded by becoming the decisive force for victory. For the British, it was a lesson in humility, a reminder that experience does not confer permanent authority, and that survival in a coalition war requires respecting partners who are willing to learn and bleed alongside you. In the end, the alliance survived its early failures and private contempt because its leaders chose restraint over pride and unity over judgment. What remained was not the memory of what was said in frustration, but the massive, coordinated machine that was built through necessity and sustained under the most intense fire history had ever seen. If you were General Eisenhower in 1943, would you have confronted Montgomery directly about his private criticisms? Or was his quiet diplomacy the only way to keep the alliance from falling apart? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell.